Well, good morning, everyone. So glad you're here. I hope you've got your coffee and water. We're going to get started. My name is Alfreda Norman, and I'm a Senior Vice President here at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, and I have responsibilities for our communications and public outreach. And this is our inaugural, this is a big deal. We're so excited. Team's been working on this for quite some time. It's our inaugural Economic Inclusion Fireside Chat. I don't know, we don't.
I'm going to start a fire back
I know,
here,
we don't have
right?
the fire, but it's the thought of it all, right? This is a new seminar series which aims to expand the Fed's understanding of how everyone can share in our country's economic prosperity and promote inclusive maximum employment. So we have a lot to talk about today. We're excited to be here with you all. We also have folks that are joining us virtually, so we welcome our virtual crowd. And I'm going to share our standard disclaimer, which is that the views shared today do not necessarily reflect official positions of the Federal Reserve System. Today, we're going to hear from our two experts here on why economic inclusion is important to both monetary and public policy. So I am pleased to do some brief introductions. You guys have very long CVs with lots of accomplishments, but I'm just going to touch on a few. First, we have Michael Weber. And Michael's an associate professor at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business and a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Additionally, Michael works as an academic consultant for the European Central Bank, the Bank of Finland, and the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland. His research areas include asset pricing, microeconomics, international finance, and household finance. Join me in welcoming Michael Weber. And we also have Jeff Ura. Jeff is a fellow at the Brookings Institution and the Eastern Bank Foundation. Jeff recently finished a 2.5-year term as a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. In that capacity, he conducted research on the Federal Reserve's new monetary policy framework and sources of the racial and ethnic wealth gap. Jeff previously served as a director of research, executive vice president, and senior policy advisor at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. Jeff, thank you for joining us, and let's give him a nice warm welcome. So we've prepared some discussion questions, but we want to make sure that you are included in this conversation. So on your table, there's a QR code. If you just put your phone on that, and please don't hesitate to submit your questions anytime during our discussion here. And for those of you that are joining us virtually, on your Zoom Q&A, you can submit your questions. Just click that Q&A function. We've got a team that's going to be reviewing those questions and sort of putting them together, and they're going to be shooting them to me on my iPad up here. So if all the tech gods work, we're going to be in good shape. So let's get started. My first question is for both of you. And I am curious, I would like to know, and maybe our audience would too, what prompted you to have an interest in the subject of economic inclusion and diversity, and how has it shaped your work? So who wants to go first?
They're pointing to me, so I'm going to go first. So good morning to everybody. It's great to be here. Great to have a conversation about these issues, which I think are first order, for sure, for this country. I don't think they always get the attention they deserve, but that's part of the reason that Alfreda and the group here at Dallas is focusing on these. Some of you, no, a couple of you know that I started off actually working in monetary policy. I was a macroeconomist. I did models and geeky things like that. But 2/3 of the way through my career, working with Ksenia in Boston and a number of other folks, I was privileged to have some exposure to life in low-income communities, often communities of color. And I contrasted what I saw there to what I had been taught about in economics and realized that there were significant gaps there, significant gaps, which folks who work in community development would not be surprised to hear about. But the run-of-the-mill economist was spending less time focusing on. To me, the gaps there were just chilling and stunning. From, yes, the racial wealth gap to differences in incarceration, to differences in access to healthcare, to differences in educational opportunity. And what propelled me into thinking more about inclusion was the realization through conversations with people on the ground, as well as with experts who'd been studying this for longer than I had, for sure, that we made this happen on purpose in this country. We made a series of choices, decisions, to include and provide opportunity to many, not all, but many white families, while at the same time excluding opportunity for many people of color. So yes, African Americans, Hispanics, indigenous people, some Southeast Asian cultures. Obviously, the most glaring stems back to our involvement with slavery in this country, but that's not the only thing we screwed up on. So the fact that we had chosen these things, and today to continue to choose them in ways that exclude people from opportunity, to me, was an observation that propelled now the rest of my career, however long that lasts. That's what I want to be working on. Not because I'm the most brilliant person, not because I'm the person who has the lived experience, but because to me, there's a moral imperative to think about these issues. And some friends of mine from faith communities, as well as just from other contexts, say this is a very moral, I'm not going to only talk about the book, but they say this is a really moral book. And I think the answer to that question is, it is. It comes from my core beliefs about what is our responsibility to our brothers and sisters who live in this country, let alone the rest of the planet, because there's a few challenges there too. But within our own borders, there are folks who have relatively little chance of succeeding. So on inclusion, my goal is to make a small contribution to making the country's economic system more inclusive by providing opportunity to attain both human and financial capital in a way that we have denied whole populations for centuries. So how could I not get involved in that inclusion part? To me, it's just so clear that that's what all of us need to be working on together. So sorry, that's like a little stump speech almost, but it's just,
thanks for sharing.
That's what I feel.
I think it's always, I think it's important to know how people decide the steps that they're going to take. So, Michael, tell us about I was reading your paper and you were just asking the question that many of us ask, which is, does diversity matter? So tell us a little bit about how you started your journey into this work.
Yeah, well, first of all, Frida, thanks a lot for having, I guess, both of us today. It's like, a great honor to be here to talk about such an important topic. So let me maybe just echo a little bit what Jeff was alluding to. So traditionally, I'm also a macroeconomist, the way economists, but also central banks have been thinking about how the world works comes from this paradigm of a representative agent. So then we have to understand, if we do a policy, how does this one person react to the policy, who has all information and then actually acts rationally to that kind of policy intervention. However, as a more empirical-minded economist, what you see in the data, and we just actually heard Jeff talking about it, there's so much heterogeneity. People are different. They kind of engage in different activities. They have different opportunities, access to different information sets. They form expectations differently, and then either choose or to kind of participate in a given policy or not. And so what we've been doing over the last almost decade by now, via large-scale surveys, often kind of having 20, 30,000 participants across the US, we kind of try to understand, first documenting, how people differ, and on the one hand, in their labor market outcomes, in terms of how they form inflation expectations, and as a Federal Reserve, oftentimes we like to think that, of course, everyone has well-anchored inflation expectations. People understand that the Federal Reserve will actually do whatever's necessary to bring inflation back to 2%. However, actually, that's not true in the data at all. You do see 40% of the population, or even in 2018, when you ask them, what do you think is inflation? They tell you it's a number of 10% or more, clearly far away from the 2% that we had around that time. And actually, this average of such a large number is again quite different across the population. As we discussed yesterday already a little bit, Alfreda, women on average have higher inflation expectations than men. We see huge heterogeneity across race and ethnicity, also along the income distribution. Then, of course, this also reflects that we have all different experiences when it comes to inflation. We go shopping in different outlets. We either can actually save part of our money, invest in real assets that partially allow us to hedge, or we live kind of paycheck to paycheck, hand to mouth. And of course, the recent surge in inflation is way more kind of costly and hit us harder. And so this empirical observation kind of triggered a series of papers and trying to understand why do we have these huge differences in lived experiences of inflation, heterogeneity in inflation expectations? Why do we see that some people react to kind of policy communication by the Federal Reserve, others don't? And then can we do something to potentially enhance the effectiveness of communication? As we maybe discuss a little bit later on, it's not enough to do good policy. It is also imperative to find ways to reach the overall population. And this reaching aspect will require not only kind of giving an interview to the Wall Street Journal, because only a small subset of the US will read the Wall Street Journal and get the policy message. You also have to outreach, go into communities, explain policy. And through that, you actually need to have the right messenger for that policy. And so it's not enough that we only listen, let's say, to Jay Powell, because many people cannot actually associate with our Fed chair, for example. We need to find also diverse communicators. And then maybe later we can also touch a bit on the labor market potential.
Yeah. Well, in fact, I'm going to follow up on that. Can you give, for those that perhaps have not had the chance to read your paper, give some examples of how you are having a better understanding of how diversity and the differences across subgroups of the population, how does that affect their understanding or for policy or for the policymakers? Give some specific examples.
No, totally. So in a recent survey with 10,000 Americans, what we try to understand is if we now send everyone the same piece of information, does it actually matter who's the messenger of that information? So simplified speaking, the way this kind of academic work is working. So imagine one kind of table in the room. You are the control group, you don't get any information. Here we tell you what the Fed is forecasting, what inflation will be in, let's say, 12 months from now. And the person who is kind of sending this message in this controlled experiment is, let's say, a white man, a regional Fed president. To the room over there, we send the same message, the forecast for inflation over the next 12 months. But this time, actually, we have, let's say, Mary Daly, the female president of the San Francisco Fed. And then to the room over there on the right, we have actually the same forecast, but this time Raphael Bostic, the president of the Atlanta Fed, is sending the message. And then what we show in the paper relative to you here on the left, if you receive information through the Fed, you all have better anchored expectations. But then we say, let's actually now compare, let's say, how Chiara is reacting to the information relative to you over there. And so the only difference between the two of you is Chiara saw a white male Fed president sending the message, and you saw Mary Daly versus, let's say, Tara, you saw Raphael Bostic. And we do actually find in the data.
And Raphael Bostic is African American.
Yes. And sorry, I should have clarified that. I thought it's so well known, but no, totally, it's my. And so what we can show in the paper is that, if we send the same message to women associated with a non-white male Federal Reserve president, subsequently, they are way more likely to actually incorporate this information in their own expectations and subsequently become actively more interested in learning about monetary policy, being more trustful in the institution. And so the bottom line of this paper is that, having a diverse composition of the FOMC is imperative to reach the overall population. Then, of course, also having potentially way more effective monetary policy, because if we kind of neglect half of the population, women, or if we neglect African Americans, of course, policy cannot actually affect aggregate outcomes effectively. And so therefore, having this diverse composition also through monetary policy communication is really important.
Right. Fascinating, I think.
Can I add to that?
Yes, you can. Go ahead, Jeff.
You can say no, too, if you want. You can just cut me off.
No, I was going to ask you a little bit about the myth, but go ahead.
Well, maybe we'll come back to the myth, because I wanted to add an episode in which I think the Fed did a particularly good job communicating with diverse audiences and also different audiences from those they usually communicate with on the monetary policy front. That's the Fed Listens project, which began in 2019, extended through the pandemic, and to a certain extent is going on today. I think the importance of that effort was engaging communities with whom community development is already connected, but the monetary policymakers, not so much. And one of the key messages that I was at the conference where this was discussed, but I do believe the chair and others heard this message from those communities is, you guys talk about business cycles and recession. In our communities, the quote is, we are always in recession. Now, what did that mean to the chair? I can't speak for him, maybe a little more now than when I was working for the Fed, but I still can't speak for him. I do believe he heard that and said, so the benefits of running the economy hot, robust, strong growth, low unemployment for a long period of time to communities that don't always participate in the economy is significant. And so today, obviously, the pandemic upset some of our plans in a variety of ways, you may have heard. So inflation, at the time that the Fed Listens event happened, inflation was very low, and so it was relatively easy then to say, yeah, let's keep the economy growing, and it really benefited folks who might not otherwise have had access to labor markets and stable employment. Today, inflation is a challenge, but that said, one, inflation's coming down. I hope we're going to get where we need to be relatively soon. But also, we have kept a robust economy going. The unemployment rate is still low, between 3.5% and 3.75%, depending on which month you look. And the benefits of that, having extended for some period now, I think are really important. So what I hope is that message we heard from Fed Listens. Once we get inflation down a little bit lower, we'll continue to operate, and the Fed will realize the value of a long and healthy recovery because it reaches into so many parts of the economy that it would not otherwise. So that Fed Listens thing, I think, really made a difference.
Yeah. Yeah, I was there in a couple of them.
Yeah.
And, it was interesting for the community to know that while they may not know or understand completely what the Federal Open Market Committee does, but they can articulate in their own voices how they're experiencing the community, the economy, and I think that's really important to the conversation. Michael, hearing that, I'm just wondering how your work and what you're doing, and particularly when you're talking to central bankers and thinking broadly, globally, does this resonate with you in any way, or what's your thinking on the work that you're doing, how it applies to policy, and maybe kind of what other central banks are even thinking of?
No, totally. It's like here I want to actually briefly maybe follow up on what Jeff was alluding to, also in his previous point already, that I think this Fed Listens event series has indeed actually made a big kind of difference. And so like when Chair Powell was kind of motivating the change in policy framework that the Federal Reserve is now kind of following, he explicitly said, like, hearing from many low-income communities that they kind of benefit or kind of a lot from tight labor markets, and allowing them to pull them into the labor markets kind of then led to this reformulation of, rather than looking like at standard overall labor market statistics, according to which we're actually doing pretty well, Jeff. But then you look at the data, there's so much heterogeneity in average labor market attachments that you really, really need to run the economy hard to pull kind of communities of color, low-income communities in general, into the labor markets. And I think that really has actually made a difference. And luckily, academic research is actually listening. So like we've now, I would say, almost a dozen papers documenting empirically that indeed, if you really drill down into the micro level and have like high quality data, you can document that a policy that puts the foot on the gas for longer, so really kind of tightening local labor markets, that's actually the time when expansionary policy is especially beneficial to like those kind of subpopulations in the US that on average have kind of the least attachment to the labor markets, like communities of color. And I think that's something that has really, really changed. And now, as someone who hasn't grown up in this country and only has been like fortunate enough to be here for 14 years now, like I can really speak not kind of based on now kind of a growing up perspective on like what Jeff is alluding to as myth, but definitely it resonates with me that we have these narratives that, for example, as Schiller from Yale has actually shown for decades that, there's kind of common narratives we tell ourselves, and they're really, really important. People kind of think, oh, well, that's really plausible without questioning these type of narratives. And I think it's really time to kind of open those, not even black boxes, but boxes of narratives and actually showing that they are just a myth, and I think academic research partially actually can contribute by documenting that indeed, there is evidence that policy either actually can or cannot kind of foster the well-being of the overall U.S. population.
Well, if you were in charge, Michael, of a central bank, what are some things that, how can policies be created with economic inclusion at the forefront and thinking about diversity to have better economic outcomes, especially for low and moderate income people if you were in charge?
I'm not sure whether everyone would want to have me in charge, but if I was in charge, and this it was partially motivated by some of the findings we have in our research, is having a diverse set of colleagues in that body that makes decisions, let's say the Federal Open Market Committee. I think it's imperative for many, many reasons. Of course, on the one hand, you have better decision making if we have different lived experiences, but then also potentially we want to represent the societies we are serving if I was a policymaker. And now more directly from our research, I think I would consider an FOMC kind of body, thinking about it like a team, and then you should actually split tasks, because the best policy cannot reach the population if you do not find ways to engaging with kind of different populations. And so therefore, making sure that people understand their voice is heard, they have a seat at the table, is imperative. And so therefore, as we partially discussed yesterday already a little bit with you, Elfrieda, so this idea that maybe you have now me communicating with German immigrants, not making this up obviously, then maybe kind of Elfrieda, you communicating to your kind of community. So having a kind of diverse set of policy communicators reaching out to their kind of communities where they are heard, I think that's really important. And so having this diverse body on the one hand to make better decisions, to make sure that different voices are heard, but then also especially from this outreach and communication perspective would really be important.
Thanks for sharing that. Even with certain goals in mind, we know that policies can have a wide range of effects based on how they're implemented. And Jeff, I noticed in your book, you talked about the importance of implementation of policy. Can you share a little bit?
Well, in part, I'll echo what Michael said, and this is something I learned through work at the Fed, learned from my colleagues and others. Economists are not really trained at all in something that you might call community engagement, in listening to real people on the ground. It's not what we do. We look at data, we look at models. Through those experiences, I think, again, that's a privilege to have had the chance to do that. I recognize what Michael said is so important, which is that if you're going to think about how to move the needle, you're going to think about how to bring better opportunity to diverse communities, one of the very first things you need to do, and one of the very second, third, and fourth things you need to do, is engage the communities in all aspects of what you're doing. And I think there are people in the room who live this and can just say, no kidding, Jeff. But there are others who don't do this for a living, and for them it's important to hear. In the identification of the issues, in thinking about what needs to be done, in involving residents in the solutions, and involving residents in thinking about whether those solutions are successful or not, ultimately. That kind of community engagement, so it's allowing the voices of the communities that you are trying to work with to be heard, to be present, and to be involved in all aspects of whatever project you're working on is critical. And I think without that, if you succeed, you're lucky. With that, you have a much better chance of success. So that community engagement, which again is for some people in the room is just preaching to the converted, but for others, it's critical to hear this. And I will say that when we would go out to talk with folks in the communities, the low-income communities of color in New England, many times we would say, interesting plan. Have you talked to the residents and other community representatives yet? And they would say, well, we're getting to that. It's hard. They would say, it's hard. And we would say, yes, it's hard. And it has to be done. You have to start on this. So I think it is becoming more widely known, and it is, of course, widely known among folks who work in the communities. But not in every instance do we practice it consistently. And until we do, I think we'll be waiting for success for a few more years, which we don't have to wait.
I happen to be partial to this because I'm over a communication and outreach department specifically, and the communication part of it is really important. And so, Michael, I wanted to turn to you and tell us a little bit about from your research. Have you learned anything about how to better formulate or implement policy through communication? To advance the goal of economic inclusion. What are you learning from your research?
Yeah, Elfrida, that's a great point. Thanks for bringing this up. So like, what you really see in the data is like what I would call policy complexity, really making a big difference. So like, if you are kind of saying, well, I take now my economic model that we are so used to kind of study, as Jeff was alluding to, and then I come up with a policy that through the lens of my model is super, super powerful. Let's call it maybe even forward guidance. And then that model would tell me like now, like my representative agent in the data, she understands that this policy will be inflationary in the future. So therefore today she also updates already her inflation expectations and then would go out and consume a lot. If you look at the data, we as economists, we didn't know what's now kind of conventionally called forward guidance puzzle, that such a puzzle would exist until a decade ago. And of course, if you tell that to like any ordinary American, they say, well, as we were alluding to, like, gotta be kidding me. How should anyone kind of understand this type of policy and then act according to what the model is predicting? So like, that's just one example. We've actually studied such an episode using microdata in Germany and compared it to like a very simple policy, which is like, for example, I pre-announced today that in the future, consumption taxes that we have in Europe will be higher. And of course, if taxes go up for common goods, it's pretty straightforward to see that inflation will be going up. And so therefore, before prices are higher, even my mom that hasn't studied economics formally would understand she, let's say, buys a new kind of car. And in the data, that's indeed what's going on. So like those two policies that through the lens of our standard models should operate exactly identically and actually stimulate the economy equally, in the data are just vastly different in how effective they are. So like policy complexity, even like at this very simple level, actually can already make a big difference. And now more concretely, like we also, Elfrida was mentioning it, like we work a lot with the Bank of Finland. And Finland is one of those nice Nordic countries where you can observe at the individual level everything you want to observe in terms of like car registration, taxable income, but also like, expectations and things like that. You can merge all of these data at the individual level. And then you kind of, through the lens of like, we do all of that, of course, on the premises of the Bank of Finland, so no identifiable information, then it's used ultimately. But what we can document, like even a policy that we've used in the US, a cash flow clunkers type policy, is actually very redistributive and regressive. Because in the data, we can show, if you look at splits by income, lower income Finns are way more likely to have an eligible car. They are more likely to have a clunker. Then the policy is introduced. Who is taking advantage of the subsidy to buy a new car? It's the top part of the income distribution. Actually, we show in the data, they are even kind of buying cheap clunkers from the bottom part of the income distribution in Finland to then actually be able to, let's say, pay $200 for a clunker and then go to the kind of scrappage dealer and get 2,500 euros for that. And what we show, actually, it's mainly because this whole process was so complex, you needed to fill out 5 different forms, go to the scrappage kind of company, get the document, go to the car dealer, get it stamped, go then back to government agencies. So of course, like, if you implement policies, even if they're well-intended, you just actually will make sure that such a policy, even such a simple policy where you might think, well, of course, it's just, you trade in an old car, get a new car, can be regressive because at the end of the day, kind of the taxes for everyone had to be raised to finance this policy, but only like high-income Finns were actually able to benefit. And so therefore, like, I think applying that now to the US, we really have to think like, implementing simple policies, making policies kind of understandable to everyone. And as part of that, then of course, the communication angle comes back in, making sure that we have like a communication where we're making sure that the overall population actually listens and understands it.
Yeah, well, these are challenges. I'm going to shift gears before I ask the room for questions. What are the challenges that we have? We've talked about economic inclusion, and we've talked about the importance of understanding diversity and how it affects decisions. I wonder if you could think about some of the challenges looking ahead that we need to think about. I know, Jeff, you mentioned changing a narrative. Michael, you might know of other research that's important to understanding these issues that are out there. Maybe there are research questions to be asked. I wonder if you could talk about the future and what might we do now that we know some of from your work.
Maybe to start, like good policy is not enough. So we need to make sure that we find ways of reaching the whole population. I think that's one key takeaway. The second concerning maybe the takeaway as someone who's not allowed to vote in this country is like this huge degree of polarization we see. So like I'm very concerned that even good policy will lead to a kind of clashback by certain parts of the population because it doesn't adhere to my narrative, let's say, because it's from the other side of the aisle. So like finding ways that actually good policy indeed is actually kind of effective and not considered partisan. And I think as part of that, it's really also important kind of to keep in mind that at the end of the day, like, the Fed is like a non-political institution. So like, just because like I might not agree, that making sure that, we find ways that communicating that the Fed tries to kind of help everyone. And so I think a key impediment to that is like a very commonly observed, I would call that zero-sum thinking kind of narrative. So like, if I'm gaining, someone else has to lose, or if there's now a policy that is maybe benefiting you, Elfriede, I will necessarily lose. So like this idea that the pie is fixed. This is one of the things that you learn early if you have some economics training. That the big aim of economics is to grow the pie, so that the piece everyone gets is actually getting bigger. And so like, if you then get a bigger piece, I can also get a bigger piece. So like communicating this idea that in the end, like even redistribution can actually benefit everyone because the pie is growing. I think that's one of the key challenges, finding ways to kind of transmitting maybe this new narrative and getting away from like a common myth of like this fixed pie. I think that's what I would think, like we need more research and finding ways to make this happen.
That sounds like a great research endeavor. What do you say about this future?
So I agree. Actually, most of the policies that I propose at the end of the book are about economic growth, in essence. They're about growing the size of the pie for everyone. They should, in some cases, be targeted to recognize our history, because I think it's just immoral to ignore that. But in the end, if the pie grows, everyone will benefit. We hope those who have suffered most will benefit disproportionately. I wanted to add, so two other challenges. One is the political environment. Let's face it, it is incredibly fractious today. It is difficult for people on different sides of the divide to talk to one another without screaming, which is sad. It's just sad. I think, so in my book and in my speaking in my life, I try to stay away from political rhetoric because I don't think it helps. I try to focus on highlighting what exists today and the facts, the data, and the history that explain how we got to where we are. And I hope that by focusing on those things, we can reach some areas of agreement on what has happened and what is, and then perhaps we can have a conversation about what to do, because there's legitimate scope of debate on what to do. But I would say the second point, in addition to the political challenges and how we deal with those, is related. It's that one of the reasons the political discourse is so fractured is because we hold different, sometimes the same, but often different narratives about why the world works the way it does. What's the appropriate role of government? How did we get to see these huge wealth gaps across races and ethnicities? How did they arise? So narratives about those things are different. Now, is it easy to change narratives? Raise your hand if you think it's easy. No, of course, nobody does. And there is some research on the psychology side that shows that changing narratives is a difference. We'd rather discard facts that challenge our narratives than change our narratives. You may see evidence that to me seems compelling, but you don't want to change the narrative. It's easier to say, well, I still believe this. Okay, so that's a challenge. But I'm trying to remain hopeful about that, because we do have experience in this country of changing key narratives. So one that comes to mind for me often is the change in the LGBTQ narrative in this country. which is not where it needs to be today, but it has definitely changed since when I was a kid. How did that happen? So here's an area where economists have relatively little standing to make claims, but I will say it happened through relationships. That is, when people had the courage to come out at first, and then when it became somewhat easier, although it's still not easy, to come out as a member of the LGBTQ community, we all, I am not a member of the LGBTQ community, we all recognized that these are people who are our friends, our children, our coworkers, our neighbors, about whom we already have a relationship, about whom we care. And in that context, we had to change our narrative. We couldn't hold the narrative of otherness or different or undeserving of basic human rights. So what do I know as an economist about how relationships work? I'm working hard to keep my own working. But I do think that is part of the solution. And so what you might say is that in the context of socioeconomic and racial division, it's harder to work through relationships because as a country, we are still very segregated by class, by race, and everything else. However, it's not entirely true. Very often, folks who are different from me in racial or ethnic characteristics or in economic class characteristics are working among us, right? They are providing services, they're working in jobs upon which we rely to survive in so many ways. And that, I think, is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to build bridges and relationships. They may not be as deep as your son. I have a son who's gay. That's a pretty deep relationship, of course. So it may not be as deep as that, but it's still a basis for building understanding that maybe, I hope, could allow or force some of us to dispel the destructive narratives, to make it hard to make change that is necessary in our country. I hope that's the case. I also think some courageous leaders, some economists too, can call out the facts and the history consistently, objectively, to call attention to what needs to be done to bring everybody to equal opportunity. So I hope there is a path forward to changing narratives, because I think without that, it's really hard to make change. But we have done it before, so I'm trying to remain hopeful.
Oh, thanks for sharing that. Now,
Sure.
Are you guys ready to ask some questions? Okay, let's see. I think I have one, just one that's already been teed up, which is a question regarding equal access to technology. What are your thoughts on the digital divide? And in other words, has increased technology usage had an impact on economic inclusion?
Michael, if you have something to say about that, I don't feel I'm an expert, but go ahead. I have a couple of ideas.
I'm the person on the stage with like no technology, so let me try nevertheless. So like I've done a little bit of work on fintech, and especially two of my co-authors at Georgetown, Francesco Da Cunto and Alberto Rossi, they've actually done extensive work exactly on this topic. And so like I do think the current state of affairs is that potentially indeed like access to technology is widening inequities and inequalities, but at the same time, there's a, to be more on an optimistic line, as Jeff was ending, like there's a silver lining, because like, if you think about the potential of what we would call like robo-advising, but not only robo-advising in the narrow sense, but robo-advising in a more broad sense of like, you can pretty much, if you kind of give access to everyone to mobile technology, you have a very cheap and simple way to send push-up messages. And then through those messages, you can say, well, now the Federal Reserve has kind of increased interest rates. How about you save a bit more? And then maybe you can nudge people indeed into increase their savings. And then you can potentially send messages about, instead of kind of leaving it at your brick and mortar bank, where maybe the interest rate you're earning is pretty kind of poor. How about, like, we Germans, we only save in what's called a Sparbuch, like no interest income earning at all. Instead, how about you think about a well-diversified kind of a stock portfolio, like an ETF, very cost effective, but it doesn't have to stop on the investment side, even on the debt side. Like you do see in the data, like it's very common, like I open my own wallet, you have tens of credit cards, and then like normally what you would say, like it makes most sense to pay back the credit card first, where you have the highest APR, so the highest interest rate. Instead, what do people do? They like to do what's called a balance matching heuristic. You say, well, I have 5 credit cards. Right now, like I have different balances outstanding. So instead of paying back first the one with the highest interest rate, I make sure that on all of them, I have $1,000 outstanding. Of course, like that's a huge financial mistake. But of course, like unless someone tells you, well, actually, we can easily send you messages via mobile technology. And this is like, what Francesco and Alberto have been documenting through a series of papers, like, technology in particular paired with some kind of form of robo-advice could be actually very helpful in increasing financial outcomes for everyone.
Sort of democratizing information.
Exactly.
Right? Any thoughts, Jeff?
Yeah. So I think technology, like every other tool, has its pluses and minuses. You can use a hammer to build a house, or you can use it to whack your neighbor on the head. So let's go for the first. Generally, that's a good idea. Technology access is the first step. I think that's great because it can be an information equalizer at relatively low cost. Although let's face it, I mean, iPhones, as it turns out, are not actually cheap. That you pay for it sooner or later, and so they're not cheap. So I think actually having programs that would make some of the technology more accessible would be good. I do want to be careful in 2 ways about technology. One is that the nudge. So I'm really fascinated by a lot of behavioral economics. The notions that small nudges and prompts can make dramatic differences in people's lives has been tested, and I think, so this is just my reading of the research, the persistence of those effects is questionable. It's probably a good thing to look at because it's low cost, but imagining that those sorts of small changes are going to make dramatic changes in the outcomes for income, education, wealth accumulation, all that, I think is somewhat wishful thinking, but I think we should still be looking at it. So the second is that one of the biggest threats of AI is not that it's going to take over the world and put me out of work. It may put some people out of work, but frankly, I'm less worried about that at the moment than the fact that AI derives its intelligence from absorbing what is already extant in the text on the internet today, very much of which embodies a whole bunch of racial and ethnic biases. And so when the prompts go out, when AI takes over to make recommendations, or when it draws conclusions about who's creditworthy or not, for example, people are aware of this, but we are still in the early stages of making sure that the embodied structural racism that's in the internet today doesn't manifest itself as AI prompts and recommendations and guidance for creditworthiness and so on. So yes, it's a tool. It can be used for good. I don't want to trivialize that a few small nudges and things, which are interesting areas of research, are going to make for sea changes. And I do want to express concern that it can embody structural biases that are in our system and perpetuate them. So we need to be really careful about not allowing that to happen. That takes serious work. So I'm hopeful, again, still, that it is going to be part of the solution, but I don't want to trivialize it because I think it's too easy to jump to simple solutions, which may be helpful and maybe help people from making really dumb decisions. One final thing I want to say about financial education. We spent a lot of time doing a disservice to the notion of what helpful financial education looks like by giving people tests that ask them if they can compound interest, for example. When they couldn't come up with compounded interest, we said, well, they've fallen behind. What we need to do is teach them to compound interest. What people need to understand, I believe, are a few basic, they're almost rules of thumb, but they're really basic common sense propositions about making a budget, about can you afford that house or not. And if they're given those sorts of basic rules, most of the people in the low-income communities are incredibly good at mustering and managing their resources. This is a fallacy. People think they're not, and it's a total fallacy. Talking to people who live in those communities, incredibly good at that. So if they have some small additional bit of baseline, simple information, my sense is that whether they can compound interest or not, or compute present values, for God's sake, they will be able to better negotiate the financial landscape. They know how to make decisions if they have the resources to do so. And they're actually incredibly good at budgeting, for example. So that's just a little side rant on financial education, which is important. But what that means is maybe even more important.
Well, thanks for touching on that. That was one of the questions someone had, was about financial
There you
literacy
go.
and education. So thanks for that. Just following up on that first question, here's another one. What extent do you believe cooperative structures from key services such as energy, telecom, and banking can help transformation of economies in underserved communities?
I think the participation of the private sector, whether it's the aforementioned or others, is critical in the end. One, because they have most of the jobs. Two, because they've been complicit, in some cases wittingly, in some cases unwittingly, in structuring a workplace that has left a whole bunch of people behind. So unless they see the value altogether in changing the implicit norms about what a workplace is like and what responsibilities employers have for their employees, we're not going to get very far only by imposing government mandates. So I think there's going to be some scope for that to coordinate the activities of a bunch of diverse businesses. They can't all be the first mover. They can't all be the person who's virtuous and suffers market share by doing the right thing. So that needs to be coordinated. But I think without their participation and cooperation, we're only going to get so far. And there are examples of some companies led by good folks who recognize the importance of making those changes. But that's I don't want to say a drop in the bucket, but it's a small percentage of the overall workforce, the employee base. So we need a much broader participation.
Thanks. Oh, there's lots of questions. I don't know which one. I'll try this one. Beyond ethics, are there macro capital forces that could potentially drive our economy to be less broken?
Sure. I was just talking,
Any
Michael, so maybe
thoughts
give
on
you a
that?
chance to, yeah.
Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, well, no, I'm sorry. No, I just,
Macro capital forces that could potentially drive our economy to be less broken.
Maybe combining that a little bit with the previous questions, like I do think, for example, that the private sector needs to play a role. That's for sure. I slightly disagree that government mandates can be the sole solution. And so what I would think, and this maybe then goes more directly to the current question, is like I would like to see our government actually providing a framework and mainly relying on the private sector by setting the right incentives. So like leaving everyone to choose, but then to say, well, if you decide to change, here's an economic incentive. And of course, like we find in our own research, like having like a diverse composition of the Federal Reserve, but also of other kind of decision-making bodies oftentimes lead to better decisions, potentially kind of enhancing creativity and productivity. But of course, like if you kind of are someone who has like economic rents, meaning like, I don't want to maybe fire my buddy because like after work, we always go for nice beer. So like, if you have personal reasons not to change, like that can be, of course, very costly for the overall organization. So like you do need potentially like, a little bit kind of a stick, but also I would say carrots to kind of provide like incentives for the private sector, potentially even through then shareholder pressure, saying, well, why didn't you actually implement this policy? Wasn't there kind of a subsidy you could have gotten from the government by changing? I think that would be like now in a very broad terms, something I would like to see from like an economic perspective.
Incentives, the right incentives.
Yes.
Yeah, and I wasn't certainly arguing that government mandates are the sole solution. All I'm saying is that in many cases, there needs to be some coordinating mechanism because relying on good behavior of private companies is not going to get very far. But putting some incentives in place, some carrots and some sticks, makes some sense. I would say, a big macro capital factor that I come back to over and over again. So in the US, private corporations accumulated $2.6 trillion of profits in 2022. In that year, and on pace this year for even more, they used over $1 trillion of those profits to buy back shares of their own companies. So one of the shortcomings of economists, and I've fallen prey to this myself, is that they will look at that and say, oh, I can tell you, here's a rational model for why it makes really good sense for companies to buy back shares. And I could write that model down too, and I don't believe it for a second. I just don't. That is not a productive use of profits. So a big capital force is to say, How about taking $1 trillion of profits that went to do nothing except prop up the value of stocks for those people who hold them, which are the already wealthy and disproportionately white people in this economy, and use it for something productive, like providing incentives to raise wages, like providing early childhood education for every family in the economy. Of course, not paying for my kids, because I can pay for my kids' early childhood education, so you have to scale that. But if you did that, early childhood education, transformational over a generation. Like providing funding for struggling community colleges that in principle at least could be the pathways from high school to job relevant training to a specific private employer who will employ them in a job that gives them a family supporting income, meaning not only them, but maybe other extended members of their family, personal and life transforming. So that's a macro capital area where, you know, look, I'm sorry, I'm not going to listen to economists anymore explaining why $1 trillion of stock buybacks is a really good thing, or explaining why there's a reason CEOs are paid on average 370 times the median employee in their firm. That's because they're important and networked companies, and the marginal contribution of a good CEO decision could add up to millions and millions of dollars. I was like, yeah, I know that. And that's just stupid. You could not, none of you in this room could go home at night and say, I deserve to earn $75 million this year because I'm so brilliant and I'm doing so much important work that I'm not going to let my employees have that when they're earning 370 times less on average. That is unconscionable. I know economists who have written models to rationalize that. I will be happy to yell at them until they tell me to go away. It won't take long. So there are some macro level things that we can address, we can reallocate. It does take some government intervention. Those companies are not going to relinquish their profits easily. But when they're not doing anything productive, please, let's channel it somewhere where it can do some good.
Well, I think maybe we should read more about the book and more about your paper. And I wonder if you two have anything that you might want to share that we didn't cover. Michael, maybe in your work, some things that you've done and you've discovered or you've thought about, or things that you're thinking about that we didn't talk about. And Jeff, anything that you might want to add before we run out of time?
You know, maybe just two general takeaways. So like, going back to where we started out at the beginning, I think for us as economists, it's really important. This is kind of going back to where Jeff also said, like, you know, going into communities, like, you know, understanding how people actually live their lives to then inform our models, and then potentially through kind of consulting, outreach, inform policies to actually make sure that indeed we are able to kind of get better aggregate outcomes for everyone. So like, what we've done through our work is kind of drilling down at the micro level. What are kind of the price signals ordinary Americans see when they walk down the aisle in the supermarket? We have access to this type of data. And then we see, like, you know, if you are someone who happens to kind of go grocery shopping, like in a pandemic, in like already a low price store, you always use kind of coupons and buy goods on sale. You cannot trade down. Instead, like, you know, I, let's say, go to Whole Foods normally, but then the recession hits. I can go, let's say, to Aldi or Trader Joe's. I never use kind of coupons, and now I start using coupons and buy goods on sale. And actually, you see in the data, like, there was a huge difference in realized inflation by race, by income. Lower income Americans had like a 2 percentage point higher realized inflation in the early quarters of the pandemic. I hadn't really seen much discussion of that in the political sphere, or like potentially like how monetary policy could address this disparate impact of inflation. And similar also like to the second pillar of like the federal mandate, the Federal Reserve mandate, like labor markets. Thinking like, you know, traditionally we like to preemptively raise interest rates, for example, in 2015, because potentially there might be inflation at the horizon, and no, God, we cannot actually have higher inflation in 5 years. So like we put the kind of the foot on the brake. And so like, you know, appreciating the fact that tight, hot labor markets, as like Okun was already saying it like decades ago, indeed, is actually something that kind of helps low and moderate income communities the most. I think having this kind of what we now call maybe heterogeneous agent model being actually indeed also like understood and kind of held at the forefront of policymaking, I think that's really important to kind of get better outcomes.
60 seconds. The last thing I want to add is that these issues that we are talking about have to be approached with a sense of urgency. There are a lot of small policies we could pursue. There are a lot of little levers we could pull that will make a small difference on the margin. That's not where we are. For my generation, the folks who already have the wealth and the power, and for the generations coming up who will have that and who are probably better motivated than my generation has been so far, we need a sense of urgency. It would be so easy for us to look back 25 years from now when I'm sitting in my rocking chair and say pretty much the same. When Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968 gave his speech about economic justice, that same speech could have been given today because it pointed to the economic builders of wealth for the white, the deniers of opportunity, and what the economy looked like. It's almost the same today. What I think would be an absolute disaster is to look back 25 years from now and say, yeah, we didn't really make any progress on wealth gaps, on income equality, on equal access to education, on building the sized economic pie in the US. That's an absolute tragedy. I think it's actually an existential threat to the country in so many ways, in the same way that climate change is. Those are the two big things. I don't know anything about climate, so I didn't write about that. But this I know something about, I hope. And I think that's the issue, is urgency. We need to do something. Everybody in this room can contribute, changing the narrative, talking to your representatives, putting these things. We talk about I went over 60 seconds. We talk about so many crazy things in the political realm that have little bearing on except to disrupt people's lives or be mean to people or hate or sow discord. This is about building opportunity. This is about, on an economic and a human scale, making sure people actually live the lives that we aspire to as a country, but we do not achieve. Urgency.
Well, thank you for your comments, and please give them a round of applause for their fabulous thinking. I also want to give you all a round of applause for being here, being a part of the discussion, listening. I would encourage you to, we've got some podcasts with these guys that we've done, and so I would encourage you to listen to the episodes on the Southwest Economy podcast. You can find that on our website. It's also on the Apple Store and Spotify. So if you want to hear more about your work, we'll be following it for sure. And we're inspired by you being the first in our series of these conversations of economic inclusion. We thank you for kicking us off.
Thank you.
I hope that you all will stay tuned for our next series. We're excited. We're looking at our 2024 lineup, where we're going to invite more scholars here to shed more light on the policies and practices, and also to hear your questions and thoughts as well, so that we can inform our selections and in fact, as you see on your table, there's a survey there. I know a survey, it's like another survey, but honestly, it helps us improve our programming. When we talked about engagement, we need you to engage in the survey to tell us what you might want to see in the future and how we can approach this conversation. I want to thank everybody that joined us virtually for joining in, and thank you again for spending the time with us, and stay tuned for our future conversations. Thank you very much.
Thank you.